Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. I am your host, as always, Dorothy, and today we have an amazing guest on our podcast. Her name is Anne Elizabeth Moore, and she is an American cultural critic, artist, journalist, and editor. Specifically, she is the author of this book called Cambodian Grrrl, self-publishing in Phnom Penh, and the follow-up book to that, New Girl Law. This book in 2012 won the SATW Foundation Lowell Thomas Travel Award and for Best Book, and USA Today also said that it was the best travel book they've read in that year. Now, I find this book to be really cool, a really cool take on the cultural differences between Western and Eastern, and is an honest reaction of an American woman stumbling upon post war society, teaching them originally about self publishing, but eventually learning where they were as a society in terms of freedom of speech, democracy, and women's rights. I love the approach on this book, and I am so happy she is here today to discuss. So, Anne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Dorothy. I am obviously a massive fan of Cambodian women's media, so I couldn't be more delighted to be here.
We are right on track here. So, let's take it back to the way beginning, Anne. Before actually, even before we before we get into the book, how did you end up in Cambodia? Really? How did that happen?
Yeah, I had been running a magazine in Chicago for a while called Punk Planet. And so I was heavily involved in sort of the punk and independent publishing scene there, which was very strong and engaging and lively and fun. And the reason that we ended up having to shut the magazine down was because it's this complicated network of things all sort of happened at the same time, but essentially postal rates changed, which made it more expensive for us to mail our magazine than it would make for a magazine like Time to mail out copies of its magazine to its subscribers. And the reasons for this were largely because, we were a small independent magazine that didn't have people on the board that were making these decisions, and Time Magazine did. And so they ended up getting really cheap postal rates and sort of charging us for it. And that basically was a cost that just killed the magazine. And so the problem with that is that, of course, then we have a situation where we live in a democracy in which it is actually too expensive for certain people to participate in the democracy, right? Especially when we're talking about independent voices. And so, I started, can I swear on your podcast? I forgot to ask.
Fine.
Okay. So I started Googling things like fucked up democracy and like democracy gone wrong, and this was back in 2007. So this was before our current moment when it's sort of clear that democracy is a big question in the American project. But at the time, what I was getting were hits on like Google hits from Cambodia, which the prime minister fairly recently to when this was happening in the United States had made an announcement that freedom of speech in Cambodia means the freedom to say positive things about your country. And to me, it's a similar thing, right? You can say anything you want as long as you are Time Magazine, or you can say anything you want as long as it's positive about the country. Right. And then I started thinking more about sort of how, I came to learn about Cambodia and, could I maybe spend some time there? And eventually I met someone who had invited me to come and live with a large group of young women who were going to college together for the first time in the country. And they were living in a big dormitory together and had just moved from the provinces I think every single one had moved directly from the provinces into this dormitory, and the dormitory had just been built earlier that year. And so in many ways, the second they entered school, and then they kind of have to deal with me, and I was coming in and I was like, hey, like, I'm a white girl and I'm from America. And they were just like, what is happening? And of course, like, delight in the best possible way. But it, there was a big, like, cultural thing there that was really ended up being one of the most important and delightful joys of my life.
Mm-hmm. And what year was this again?
So I arrived in Cambodia in, I think, late November 2007.
Okay, and you were there for...
I was there originally for 2 or 3 months.
Okay.
And then, of course, fell in love with the country and the young women I was working with. And so I continued to return every year for 2 to 3 to 4 months sometimes,
Wow.
for the next 7 years. And so I, felt like I was living in two places that whole time. I was just so constantly invested in what was happening in the country
Yeah.
right up until 2014.
Yeah. And you were there, from what I've read, to initially teach them about Zigning, and this is new for me, but basically it is a method of self-publishing. It's learning how to bind a book, isn't it?
Yeah. So the it's often pronounced zines,
Oh,
which is
zine.
a term for it's the idea is something like Time magazine is a magazine, but
Mm.
an independent publication is just a zine. Like, it doesn't need all that fancy,
Oh, I see.
magazine terminology. And so in the 1980s, women science fiction creators in particular, who weren't getting published in the sort of big science fiction magazines, just started photocopying their own stories and sending them to each other. And
Mm.
from this emerged this whole network of underground and independent publishing that was really just about, like, putting the thoughts on the page, making as many copies for whoever wanted to read it as cheaply as possible so that you could disseminate it to as many people as possible.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, that's a process that I'd been involved in since I was 11. So when the opportunity came up to live with these young women, um, and especially in the moment that I was in, where I was sort of fearing for the future of independent media practices in the
Mhm.
US, they had wanted me to teach something to the young women in Cambodia. And I like only really know how to do one thing. So I was like, well, I'll teach them how to make zines, like, it'll be fine. Um, but as you know, that hits all sorts of pressure points within Cambodia about women's rights to speech, freedom of speech, protections under the law, um, women's ability to participate in public life. And so it wasn't actually, entirely fine, but it was great and amazing and effective and wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you arrived to Cambodia, do you remember, I know this is in '07, but do you remember your just initial thoughts when you first came? And was there a particular moment that made you realize, oh gosh, we are not in America anymore?
Oh my God. Well, like, I will say, I mean, I had traveled internationally before that, um, in Europe and in North and South America and Central America pretty extensively. So I have spent a lot of time in other parts of the world, but um, but I had never spent time in Southeast Asia, and I knew enough to know before I left that I would very often not have any idea what was happening, and so I was a little bit terrified for months leading up to my departure, um, because I don't like not knowing what's happening. Like, it's very uncomfortable for me. Um, And so even like, the way we boarded the Singapore Airlines flight, the way that we, all of these practices, it just started very quickly shifting from a, Western American, and Chicago in particular,
Mm-hmm.
way of moving through the world to something that I had to relearn on the fly. But I will say that the biggest moment that I recall, um, just letting my eyes go super wide, was in 2007. There was like, there wasn't like, Facebook wasn't popular, the internet wasn't very well used, and it wasn't widely available. And cell phones were even sort of hard to get a handle on. It wasn't smartphones, it was still just sort of um, number phones. And so there wasn't a ton of awareness about what American culture meant, except for, pirated movies. And
Mm-hmm.
only the most popular ones
Right.
were watched. And so I remember walking around Phnom Penh at some point, and I went into a store and everyone was wearing like Santa hats, and I was like, "Oh, a Santa hat," and someone said, "Yes, we love Jesus," and I was like, "Oh, right," because we're associating that with this time of the month, but we don't really, understand like the
Yeah.
nuances of the thing. And from then on, I just kept tracking the way that shifted over the next couple of years to being like, oh, Jesus and Santa aren't the same person, and they're actually different figures, but they refer to the same time period.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was a long process. But also what was happening in 2007 was the very first time um, that people really had access to earning money. And so the economic rise was just beginning then. And so
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden there were jobs, there were, not a ton of them, but like people were just starting to be able to um, make their own way in the world financially. And so, that was kind of an amazing thing to watch happen too, like
Yeah.
severe poverty to like people actually emerging from it.
Yeah.
But again, yeah, that took years.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there a particular moment, um, specifically when you realized the cultural differences, specifically in terms of like the clash that you had written about in the book, the freedom of speech and the democracy, and kind of like the differences in views on and women's rights? Was there like a specific conversation you had with maybe one of the girls, or a particular moment that really sparked, oh wow, like um, this is this is where they're coming from?
Well, the young women I was working with were, of course, very clear and knowledgeable about what they had experienced,
Mhm.
but um, they hadn't necessarily been given information about why that had been their experience. So they didn't both, understand the Khmer Rouge history, but they also didn't understand the sort of contemporary laws or gender norms. I mean, like, who does when you're 17, 18, 19 anyway? But um, but so they were also my primary source of information for this stuff. So I was sort of piecing it together through conversations, many of which were transcribed in Cambodian Grrrl. But a couple of the but sometimes what would happen would be that I would bring their work out into the world, which we did, anonymously and sort of in a public way that no one in particular would get in trouble for it,
Mhm.
but so that they would have some sense of the impact that they were having on their own culture. And whenever I did that, someone would always pull me aside and sort of say, "Do you know what you're doing? Because this is really dangerous. And it was everyone from like, some white tourist dude that was like, I'm going to tell you, little missy, what's going on in the world, to like, you know, woman Cambodian shopkeeper, to like,
Yeah.
a guard with a gun, who maybe was looking to, like cause further trouble.
Yeah.
So there was a whole range of ways that it became clear to me that what the boundaries were and how difficult it was to approach them in any way.
Yeah. And you were working with these girls and they were writing their own opinionated pieces, right? And you were helping them zine the
Hmm.
books. I find that to be, I mean, just I could only imagine what how different it must have felt, or how also just liberating the girls must have felt through that process as well. Um, I was diving into the idea, and I'm gonna chop this up, and I should know how to say this, but I don't speak Cambodian. But the book that kind of outlines the way women are supposed to act. It's called the Chap Srey, is that right?
I've heard it Chbab Srey, but
Chbab Srey.
Srey maybe also makes sense. Yeah.
Chbab Srey. Okay. Where
Yeah.
did you learn about that? Was it also through the girls in one of the interactions with them? And I wonder what their experience was knowing and growing up with that, and the action of also learning how to zine.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, honestly, it was completely amazing. The printing and publishing in Cambodia are so prized anyway, like no under any circumstances. So like documents are so important, and putting things on paper is just so revered, um and like keeping documents from certain occasions is such a big deal that um that it was sort of like lovely anyway, right? But once I began to understand about the Chbab Sarai, and I think that the girls mentioned it first in one of our sessions, because we would do like big rooms full of all 32 young women would be together, and we would sort of work through big ideas together, and basic like skill stuff. Um, but then we would also do like smaller individual sessions. And so I think that one of the young women who actually went on to become a human rights lawyer, of course, sort of mentioned it at some point. But I also was taking lessons in Cambodian language from one of the women that worked in the dormitory. And so it was this neat thing where the young women would bring something up and they would sort of explain everything about it that they understood. And then I would be able to bring it to my language instructor and say, what does this mean? Like there can't really be a book that outlines rules for girls. And she would be like, actually though, like it really does. And here's what it says.
Yeah,
And that was, I mean, part of that one in particular was just pure shock that gender norms would be so entrenched that they would actually be committed to text and then sort of handed out as if like, these are the rules,
right,
can't do anything about them.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for my listeners, by the way, who don't know what that is, can we just briefly explain what the Chbab Srey is? I know that we kind of mentioned and alluded to it, but what
Yeah.
is
Well, what I understand is that there are two books that are Cambodian literature is big on printing aphorisms, which are sort of short nuggets of text that provide lessons for living.
Mhm.
And the Chbab Sarai and Chbab Sros? I'm not remembering. There's rules for girls and rules for boys. And each of them dictates a specific way that girls and boys are to go about navigating the world. The rules for boys are, of course, like, do whatever you want. It's your world. Have fun. Enjoy yourself. Like, have sex. Why not? You know? And the rules for girls are very much never be alone with a man. Don't look him in the eyes. When you walk, don't make too much motion with your skirt because it might be distressing for the men in the room. Whenever a baby enters the room, make sure that you are taking care of it. And these things that to my mind, particular at the time, and I think we'll probably get to this in a minute, but I had come out of the Riot Grrrl movement in the United States, which was just a very feminist, punk, DIY, girl forward approach that absolutely does not prize men in a room more than anyone else. And so to me, these things were damaging and abhorrent. And like, I absolutely respect, Cambodian culture, the traditions of sort of all nations that emerge from these gender norms and the ways that societies have to build themselves. I sort of respect and understand it, but just to be someone that might be placed under those kind of restrictions, I just was horrified, and I was horrified for these young women. Some of them I kind of like I like the idea of walking through a room and not making any noise, but that's just like the way that I like to conduct myself. But for a rule book for young people to include support for young men who may wish to have sex with whoever they want, and denigration for young women for even considering the option of talking to men alone, it just strikes me as a horrible situation to be in. Yeah. And there's the last I was in the country, which now was almost a decade ago, but they were still like available for sale. When your neighbor has a new baby, you can give them to them. And, so these aren't documents, these aren't historical texts. These are, or were at the time, like living,
Yeah. Did you notice that the existence of that and that influence of that being an issue and an influence to some of these girls as they were also zining with you?
Yes, 100%. I mean, I noticed it across the way that they were experiencing being in this new city environment,
Right.
in general. They really struggled to sort of ask for what they needed in the classroom because, of course, most of the instructors were male. Most of the other students were male. And if you can't look a boy in the eye, it's really hard to get information in the classroom. And so I noticed some of them trying to figure out how to deal with that, very traditional lesson, but still needing to like get through the day. But then in terms of the zines, they often wrote about, and while we were making zines, they would discuss how they had not had this experience before of telling their own stories, or even telling any stories, of being able to speak or write or draw.
Right.
And a lot of that stuff comes directly out of the Chbab Srey. and it was very, there was one woman in particular who, of course, went on to be a journalist, who I remember her sitting down and taking a piece of paper for the first time, and she set it out in front of me, and she got like every colored pencil in the building, and she put that, on the sort of top above the page on the table. And let's just quickly shut my email down so that doesn't happen again. And she set everything out on the table in front of her, and then she looked at me and she said, Anne, I have never been allowed to draw, and I don't know how to do it. So I'm going to draw my house. And she just drew this like elaborate, very beautiful, like traditional Cambodian house on the stilts. And then she kind of finishes and she puts it aside and she said, now I am going to write the history of my village. And she just like zipped through like 10 different pieces of paper. And then by the time she was done, she was like, okay, like I know what I'm going to do with my life now. And it was really stunning. It was just an amazing moment. Like as a teacher, you always want to be in those moments where people are learning who they are.
Right.
And that was the process. It was amazing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How incredible to witness.
Yeah. Yeah.
I on this podcast, we talk a lot about the after effects of the Khmer Rouge. I've brought in a lot of different doctors and historians, psychiatrists, psychologists who have studied different aspects of post Khmer Rouge and how it's affected people and women. I can imagine you being there, teaching these women, kind of having that firsthand experience of interacting with these women post-war. I mean, '07, that's probably, I think that's closer to the Khmer Rouge than we are now. In what ways did you see and witness the after effects of the Khmer Rouge in these women, if any? But
yeah. Well, it was not clear to me for the first couple of weeks that they did not know about the Khmer Rouge. It was still illegal to teach in the schools. It was left out of the textbooks. In 2007, there started to be some discussion that it might be included in a future textbook. I think by 2011 or 2012, the textbook had been written but wasn't widely available yet. I'm not entirely sure on the timeline, but to me, it makes sense why your parents wouldn't talk about a horrible traumatic event that they had gone through. My parents didn't talk about their horrible traumas, but I didn't understand what it meant that their history textbooks just kind of didn't explain what happened between 1975 and 1979. Mm-hmm. And so I think what happened was that at some point I was going, to do the tourist thing and going to visit I can't remember if I went to the killing fields or Tuol Sleng first. But, the girls would ask me what I was going to do the next day. And then when I came home, we would have a big conversation over dinner about what I had done that day. And they would tell me everything that they learned in school and everything that they had to read that night. And then update me on their crushes, which was the best part of the day. So at some point I was like, well, I'm going to go to the killing field, which is a horrible part of your history, but I feel like to be here and to really understand your culture, I feel like I need to be that kind of tourist. And they were like, yeah, you should definitely do all of the things that are available to you. But we do have a question. What is the Killing Fields and why does it have such a horrible name? And I think in that first moment, I kind of begged off. I kind of said, oh, I'm going to get back to you about that.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to be like, oh, by the way, 4 million people, da 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 da.
Yeah.
And also I hadn't been there, so I didn't want to say what I thought it would be like. Anyway, and so I went, and then a couple of the girls, asked me about it again later, and I said, well, this, horrible thing happened in your history, and this is a place where like it's sort of evident what had happened and how it had happened. And we didn't go into too many details, but as they started to make more and more zines, and as they started to tell their own stories more and more, the Khmer Rouge legacy started to seep in. And so one of the young women started drawing a story about how she used to go play at her grandparents' house, and she would play in the backyard while her grandparents were cooking, while her grandma was cooking dinner, and she would sort of like be playing in the dirt, and she would like dig things up and come and show her grandma, and her grandma would just get really angry. And she sort of pieced together later that she was digging up human remains of her own family member that her grandma, for obvious reasons, didn't want to have to explain. And so that, was one clue for them. And then they would sort of all talk about it and sort of come to an understanding about what had happened in her family. And then one of the other young women had a father who was a soldier for a while with the Vietnamese army. And so she had a pretty interesting like military understanding of what had happened, and remembers hearing about the refugee camps that she was, I can't remember if it was before she was born, that they were living on, that she just heard stories about later, but she had some awareness of what those were. And so that came into the group understanding of their own history. And sort of little by little, these young women, even though they weren't taught this in school, it all began to build up an understanding of what their country had gone through. And so by the time I left, they actually asked me to take them to the killing fields. And a number of them, got into the tuk-tuk with me, and we went out and we, did the tourist thing. And at the time, in 2007, it was still like really, I mean, it wasn't Cambodian owned still. So that continues to be a problem, but it was still just really raw land. And there were still just piles of buried bodies and shirts sort of stuck in the ground. And so it was very clear, kind of what had happened there. And, I was horrified. The girls were horrified. And then when we got home and we had dinner, one of the young women was really quiet. One of them very talkative. They're all very talkative, but one of them in particular became particularly quiet. And I said, what is happening? Do you want to talk about it? And she said, I'm so angry, but I'm not just angry on this day. I'm angry on all the days. And that particular expression of a rage that you are born into and then just continue to live with every day, I was like, oh, I get it, and I'm going to do everything I can to like lessen that for you. But, I don't know that either of us ever sort of came to any sort of resolution about it. But I
Yeah.
do know that naming it for her was also this really important thing of like, oh, there's a reason that I have been feeling this way my whole life. And that was fascinating.
I can almost imagine this process of teaching them about self-publication, encouraging them to express their feelings through papers, teaching them how to draw and lean into artistic ways that they can express themselves and express kind of the feelings inside, is therapeutic. And I think it's amazing that you were able to just kind of witness that, it seems like.
Yeah. Um, I'm definitely not a therapist. Like I'm so far away from being any
Yeah,
sort of a therapist.
sure. Yeah.
But I do know um, what happens to a person when they are able to see themselves on the page. And
Mhm.
that is amazing. And I am so lucky that I was able to witness it, across this whole student population of 32 young women. I watched 32 young people fix something about themselves into a publishing format and
Mhm.
and then be able to like live with it as an object that proved who they were to themselves and to other people. And that is, I just feel so much gratitude and luck and love for that. But I think the thing that's harder to see is that they were 100% teaching me every skill that it takes for me to get through my day now, right? So the patience that they were born with, even just to be a young woman where something like the Chbab Srey lives,
Mhm.
um, I had to learn from them. And I also had to learn all sorts of things about living with other people that I just have never had the opportunity to. I was 37 when I was living with them,
Mhm.
and I was sleeping in a bunk bed in one of their rooms. I had three roommates, and um, and they also like just loved me in a very forgiving and like constantly affirming way. And so figuring out what that looks like and feels like and how to do that
Mhm.
changed my entire life. So yeah, so I get a little like I always kind of want to correct the record when we talk about what I brought to them, because whatever it was that they brought to me, which was everything in my life, is just so much more that I did nothing, literally nothing in comparison.
No, I empathize with that that kind of feeling of being in a situation where you feel like you've gotten so much more, and um it just shows your humility, and I think that's amazing. Um let's talk a little bit about your book. So,
Great.
you are the author of Cambodian Grrrl, self-publishing in Phnom Penh. And then post that, you also had the follow-up book, New Girl Law. We've talked a lot about just like the amazing experience that you had experienced there. At what point did you decide that you wanted to turn this into a book?
Yeah. Well, I when I went was actually keeping a pretty regular blog, which who knows what a blog is anymore, but it used to be a kind of online writing that you did. And I would update it like once or twice a day. And it was a way for me to both be in a completely, new to me space, and be a very foreign presence, and really immerse myself in Cambodian girl culture, without getting too lonely or feeling like I was losing my mind, which I probably did lose my mind at least a little bit. And also to sort of stay lightly connected to people in the US who are largely the original readers. And the blog became very popular very quickly, and people really, really loved it. And and so I just felt like the writing that I was doing was like, there's something about that time that was really raw and engaging and exciting and enthusiastic. And I really, I loved it. And I loved that I felt like I was able to capture to some degree the love that I felt for these girls. And so I wanted that to live in a different format later. And so the blog posts, were sort of heavily edited and then turned into this book. But it's got a very similar sort of structure and storyline. And so I self-published a version of that in probably 2010, and then we published the slightly larger version in 2012, I think. Yeah. And then New Girl Law, which was intended to be the follow-up, which is, of course, the direct English translation of Chbab Srey, was the narrative of us, the young women and I, specifically sitting down to rewrite the rules for girls in Cambodian culture. Maybe between those two books, I also released a book of photography from Cambodia called Chbab Srey. That was really fun. That only included one essay, but I was also like publishing journalism from the garment industry and traveling with some certain musicians and doing various being involved in various activist things. And so I was really just like publishing a lot on Cambodia for a period there, about which I have now conflicting feelings. But the point is that at the time it was entirely natural that I would put this out as a book.
Yeah. And Cambodian Grrrl, the spelling of it, do you mind maybe giving a little bit of background as to why we are spelling it Grrl without the I?
No. So that directly comes out of Riot Grrrl, which is the sort of feminist punk movement I was talking about earlier.
Right.
And Riot Grrrl was among the punks and scruffy-haired losers, particularly of the Pacific Northwest and Washington, D.C., in the early 1990s, was a group of young women who had been like hanging out, making music, making zines, making their own culture, and feeling like they were participating in building a new kind of America, right? And then as we started to experience more and more pushback from the men that thought that they really understood better than what punk was than anyone else, we sort of started talking about what we were doing as a movement, right? As we were Riot Girls, and there are two versions of the spelling. There's GRRL and there's GRRRL, and I just like the one with more R's better. I think it's funnier. But so the idea for naming the book Cambodian Grrrl came out of that connection, my history, and sort of, Riot Grrrl and DIY feminist self-publishing in the US. And then, of course, going to Cambodia and teaching these skills to these particular young women that, didn't really pick up on the aesthetics of the Riot Grrrl movement, but they definitely got the impetus and emotions of it, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And New Girl Law, was it was it in kind of an was it an actual conversation where you guys had with the girls as how you would change it, or was this something that came kind of uh from from your own mind? And was it an actual thing that happened, or something that
Yeah.
you envisioned?
It was an actual conversation. We had two big sessions with all the young women in the dorm at the time. And actually, it wasn't, I will say, it didn't come from me in the first place. It came from one of the young women that was living in the dorm. At some
Mhm.
point, she sort of said, like, well, now that we've learned self-publishing, and now that we know, like, how this works, like, why don't we just rewrite these rules for girls? And so it was very much like a project that she first presented, and then we had to kind of work a little bit to get some buyback from everyone else. And then by the time we met, everyone just had ideas. We were just like, writing stuff on the board and arguing about wording and really coming to a consensus about what was a good mix of traditional rules that still they felt might support them into the future, especially the future, as I mentioned, where economic growth seemed possible for the first time in
Mhm.
their understanding.
Right.
Yeah, so they did that. And then eventually I brought that text back home. And with an art organization in Providence, Rhode Island, I actually printed, I think, 100 copies of that book on letterpress um, paper, and then turned those into like very traditional gold silk bound books. And
Wow.
they were so beautiful. I may only have like one or two of them left, but we just really like went to every extreme that you can imagine to make these just beautiful, beautiful rules for girls.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely love that concept. And I can only imagine just the energy and the great vibes that was happening in that kind of discussion room of
Yeah.
brainstorming. What would we do with this kind of newfound strength of kind of pushing the borders, which is not what they were really grown that well, not what they'd grown up with, but this kind of newfound strength of learning how to zine. And okay, well, let hypothetically, let's say if we were to change it, how would we do this? And just like the energy in that, I think that's so wonderful. um I have I have so much admiration for you, truly. I think that's, I mean, it sometimes it it takes it takes somebody maybe outside of their own culture to come in here and unexpectedly, I think it's beautiful how you started out with just wanting to teach them a skill that actually taught them further to maybe question or even think or poke at the the lessons that they had been taught as young girls, and how they're supposed to act and how they're supposed to be. And um no, I think that's, I would have loved to be in that room with you when I would have
Well,
when
I
I
mean,
would have
anybody who walked in had so much fun because it was just exactly that. It was like
yeah.
young women being like, okay, but you know what we could do? I mean,
Yeah.
that was the moment that most reminded me of these early Riot Girl conversations in the 1990s where you were just like, okay, but what if we put on our own shows? Like, what if boys just weren't even allowed in the venue? Like, then there wouldn't be any sexism for one day, and that would be such an amazing relief. Um, but I will also say that, like, um, all of that next level stuff that came from them. I taught them like the logistics of making a zine and putting the stuff on the paper and then bringing it to the photocopier, and that the basics. That's what I can do. And
Yeah.
so all of the rest of it of like, okay, but you can use this as a tool to teach to learn, to inspire, to like share, to, you know, keep histories, that all came from their own, you know, brilliance.
Mm-hmm.
And they a couple of them in particular got really excited about bringing zine making workshops back to their home provinces and actually presenting those same skills in Khmer to, you know, very, very, very rural cultures with no city centers. And that was just, you know, so much fun, because that, you know,
Yeah.
in a million years I wouldn't be able to be involved in something like that. But watching them grow from just this one dumb thing that I know how to do was, yeah, really amazing.
Yeah. So you loved the girls so much that you ended up coming back. You said that for the next 7 years, did you mention?
Yeah, 7 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
7 years for like 3 or 4 month periods at a time. What would you say? How did you witness? Did you witness their growth further year per year? What was the kind of um, the I'm at a loss for words, but what was just like the progress that you witnessed in front of you as you kept visiting back and the
Well, you
change?
know, yeah, they were young women coming into their own lives. And
Yeah.
so I watched them graduate and go into the world and try to find jobs, which then was like, oh, right, they've made all this progress, but the world hasn't. And so, you know, the smartest ones that had the most potential, of course, were like, I guess I work as a bank teller now, even though I should literally be running the, you know, Cambodian, like, current currency exchange or whatever, the treasury, I guess. And so, you know, I think, of course, um, that is the process of aging in many ways, right? Like you see the potential of the world, and then the world doesn't really conform to what you think it could be, and that's really frustrating, especially I think for them to be really like the first 32, you know, at least like English and Cambodian educated, yeah, like large body of young women in the country. Um, and so I think there was some frustration there. And, you know, the country, of course, like sort of lagged in keeping up with their potential. And then in 2014, things took kind of a bad turn politically. And, you know, the garment workers had been organizing, and they started to hold protests, and more people got involved. And, um, you know, at some point there were 100,000 young women in the streets. And this was, you know, this was like young women that
Yeah.
were making political demands in Cambodia. So we can sort of see how that would have been shocking and frustrating. And it, you know, they wanted an increase to the garment worker base wage, and you know, a tiny one was offered, and the garment worker said, no, that's not good enough, so we need the prime minister to step down. And the prime minister said, you think I'm going to do that for you? That's not going to happen. And opened fire on the protesters, and a number of people died. A lot of people were injured. A bunch of people were arrested, and I was there that day. And I can't even describe the heartbreak of that, right? Like,
Yeah.
some of those women I had been working with on sort of zine making projects, and, you know, and sort of tools that would help them organize themselves, events and things like this. And, um, you know, it's pretty chilling when your prime minister opens fire on your political demands. That pretty much shuts you down.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was actually the last time that I was in the country. Not, you know, because of the heartbreak, but but things just, became more difficult, I think, for everyone for a period of years there.
Yeah.
I also happened to get sort of, I became ill at that time, and it became more difficult for me to travel for long periods of time. So a bunch of stuff shifted at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the frustrating thing about this moment of history, where we're seeing, a return to regression on women's rights in particular all over the world. And, these several movements toward women's self-actualization or empowerment or, any semblance of freedom whatsoever are just being clamped down on. And
Yeah.
so yeah, even though like many of the women that I was working with did go on to become like professional human rights lawyers, to lead the first LGBTQIA organization in the country, marrying their girlfriends also, sort of do their own like amazing international journalistic work. I think that the country itself has sort of leveled some of that out a little bit. Not the country as a whole, but the government.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think that is? Is it just because tradition is just coming back stronger? Is it COVID? I mean, why
I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand why in the US all of a sudden we have to deal with actual Nazis again. Like all of these things that I felt like had been pretty clear on 25, 30 years ago, are all of a sudden reemerging. Roe v. Wade is now,
Mhm.
dead again. So I don't, uh, I guess history kind of works like that sometimes, but I'm not sure, it'll take me a while to understand what the confluence of forces, one of which is obviously COVID. But there are some like non-pandemic economic issues that drive these fears and regression too. But I think one of the reasons that I didn't end up committing to Cambodia full time forever and just settling there, which I very much thought I was going to do at some point, was because I felt like if that were to happen somewhere, it might happen in Cambodia, but it wouldn't happen in the US. And now I understand that I was dead wrong, that it absolutely is happening in both places. And it seems to be the same kinds of forces, and it seems to be causing the same effects in the same people. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your, kind of going back to the evolution of women's rights that you had witnessed for that particular time, and the following visits afterwards, what you had witnessed in terms of the evolution of women's rights. I guess now we had kind of alluded to that currently, and I agree with you in this particular time period. It's fluid, and kind of regressing at this point, but wanted to kind of get your thoughts on Cambodia and the evolution or the unevolution, if you will, of of women's rights from when you first were there teaching those girls.
yeah. Right. Well, in 2007, for sure, I was, especially with the young women that I was working with, who, as I say, like, couldn't be expected to understand an international, much less like American notion of feminism, sort of growing up in the provinces. But I sort of gave them as much of a history and an understanding as I had access to at the time, or the tools that would allow me to share that with them. And so, they they got it pretty quickly. Obviously, I think pretty much everyone who lives in some sort of state of oppression understands when they're shown that that oppression has a history and that it can be overcome. The people get that. And then, so that's 2007. And then by 2010, 2011, I began working with a group of young women, garment workers, and political activists that were also performing in a band called the Messenger Band. And I was working with them and traveling around. And I did one Christmas show with them, which was also sort of the first big benefit for a trans women's organization that was just emerging in the country. And what we did was that we, put everybody into 2 vans and we drove south and we set up this big tent in the middle of a field. And then we invited the whole town, and then the whole town came out. And so this is 2010 in the actual very rural provinces of Cambodia. And the entire local government came out and were delighted to be participating in this trans women's fashion show. And then this band of young women that were just making their own music. And so what I was able to see in that moment in 2010 in Cambodia was that these things, they don't have to be politics, right? We don't have to politicize our rights to determine our own gender identities and our ability to perform those gender identities in public. We can just do them. And even people who would traditionally be against those identities just get into the moment, right? It doesn't have to be an issue. And for this 24-hour period, because it really took a very long time to set up this venue. And then the show was also very long. It absolutely wasn't. And so that was the first time that I really got that this oppression that happens in Cambodia in particular isn't endemic to the people that live there, that can be ignored. It can be gotten over, it can be sort of abolished. And that felt like a whole amazing trajectory of its own. And then to go from that to in 2014, obviously young women are going to lead the world's largest, or the largest political uprising in Cambodian history. Obviously that's the next step of that. That also felt very much of a piece.
Yeah.
And yeah, I continue to be angry that we couldn't just see what might happen next, that, oh, maybe just women just lead the country now, that. Let's try that for a while. But maybe, the next round, we will sort of get to watch this full evolution of how that works. But it might take a while.
Yeah. Would you be open to going back to Cambodia anytime soon?
Oh, I would go back in a heartbeat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even this year, I was like, okay, I got to get my butt in gear. I think it's time. It does remain a little bit tricky with my sort of medical issues, but I imagine I can figure out a way. So yes, I look forward to it very, very, very much. Do you want to meet me there?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
I would love.
Let's go. I have all sorts of people who would love to meet you.
Well, as we kind of wrap up, I want to ask a few more questions just about the books that we have been talking about, Cambodian Grrrl and New Girl Law. What would you say would be what were your goals for releasing these 2 books?
Well, that does get into kind of the tricky question. I tend to write to kind of fix an experience and emotion um, on the page. And I want that to be legible to people. But what I didn't understand really at the time, and something that it took me a while to kind of see, is that when you do that, or when you do that with any piece of media, you essentially make a roadmap for other people to kind of want to do the same thing. And so one of the frustrating things as a white woman writing about a Cambodian, a sort of non-Western culture, is that I got emails for about a decade from people who were just like, okay, how can I do that? Like, tell me the exact steps that I need to go through to do that, because I too want to save Cambodian girls, which just felt like not what I had intended to do, and not the message that I had intended to convey. And that that I didn't quite understand well enough how the instinct to sort of white saviorize was so much at the fore in that time in particular. And if I had understood that, I would have written the book in a totally different way. I would have like edited that original text down, and I would have been much more clear about maybe setting it up as a memoir, like writing about it in a particular way. But then when it became kind of a thing that people did, was that they went and they like taught young women in Southeast Asia. There were projects that emerged in Thailand and in Vietnam, and then eventually in Laos. It really felt like, I mean, of course, I want people to use and have access to all the skills that they want, but it doesn't seem to me to be translatable to be like, no, of course you will always come across the same enthusiastic, brilliant group of young women that will be able to turn this into something that really shifts the way that people think about their country. And that I didn't want to sort of set up a generation of like young white women to want to do that.
Yeah.
So it was very complicated. I had very complicated feelings about it for a very long time. I mean, I still obviously do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very clear, at least through this interview, that the fact that you are even kind of questioning the way that you presented it initially, and then the reasoning behind the book, um, and the fact that you are so sensitive to that, to that idea of not coming off as being the white savior, and not wanting to like present that and replicate that and showcase that as a way for other people, and that you are even questioning that, because I think a lot of authors don't, right? And a lot of people who write media and put books out there and content out there don't have that same kind of sympathy as you have clearly shown in this interview, is also just a a highlight to you, I think. And I appreciate your vulnerability and just being so honest here.
Well, thank you. Of
Yeah.
course, though, right? This is one of few times that I get to talk to someone who might have a better understanding of the situation than I do. So this is fantastic for me.
Yeah. Well, Anne, I appreciate you so much for coming on to the podcast and sharing your knowledge, sharing your energy, sharing your experience with the girls and just what you'd witnessed, the evolution that you have seen throughout the years. And um, I know that we are not we're in terms of women's rights, we're not exactly where we want to be right now, but um, it's it's it hopefully this can give somebody hope in the future that some sort of cycle can happen again. So for anybody who wants to find your book, where can they find you and find some more information about you?
The easiest place to find me and links to everything that I have written is at AnneElizabethMoore.com.
Okay. Wonderful. So anyone who wants to go get a copy of that, definitely check it out. I know it's also offered on Amazon. But again, Anne, thank you so much for being here. What a lovely conversation just about so many different diverse topics.
Oh, thanks, Dorothy. It was just a joy. I'm such a big fan of your podcast. I can't wait to hear it.
Thank you.